Greetings all, and welcome to Daily Pali Reading. Today I wanted to talk about some of the issues that arise when we start to read the, say, the Pali of the Buddha, the Buddha's teachings in Pali, say, as opposed to, say, something like DeSilva's Pali Primer. And I don't want to use the word jarring, but when I sort of went from the Pali Primer to something like we're going to look at today, it just felt a little overwhelming, maybe is a way to say that. Uh, it certainly was, it seemed a little, well, it seemed almost foreign. And part of that is because I think when we first start Pali and when we go through something like DeSilva's Pali Primer, we're trying to, or she is setting out Pali in a very easy to understand way so that we can absorb vocabulary and forms. And that's a beautiful thing. And there are videos I have planned to put up about which praise not only DeSilva's Pali Primer, but DeSilva and her other writings on the Buddhist teachings. I think it's a marvelous book. But I would say as early as possible, I would advise people, if the goal, and it's usually the goal, is to read the Pali Canon, to kind of go in that direction as soon as you can. I would say by the time you get to the 8th chapter of Pali Primer, you can do that. You can also, of course, while you're reading the Pali Primer, go through Worder's Grammar or Gare and Karunatilaka. And Gare and Karunatilaka, some of their first readings are like what we're going to go over right now. So if we look at this reading, which comes from the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, found in the Digha Nikaya, in the Mahavagga, the second section of that, you'll see I've color-coded some words in blue, and I'll just read through the whole thing. Ekayano ayang bikave, mago satanang vishudiya, soka paridevanang samatikamaya, dukkha domanasanang atangamaya, nyayasa adhigamaya, nibbanasa sachikiriyaya, yadidang chataro satipatthana. So it's a pretty long sentence compared to, again, some of the things that you might learn, some of the sentences and passages you go through in Pali Primers at the beginning. And I'll just kind of highlight a couple of things that are different when we start to read the Buddha's actual words in Pali. One thing is that you're going to get words that are just run together. So like this, for example, is echo and ayano. But when they are pronounced together, ek ayano. Same meaning, just the way it got pronounced. And of course, remember, these suttas were written down centuries and centuries later. This was an oral tradition. The writing preserves what was actually spoken. So if, say, you'd gone to the 8th chapter of Pali Primer, almost all of this will look somewhat familiar, like the endings of the words. If we went to the very end, you're like, this is a word that means namely. Chataro, we haven't gotten to numbers yet. This means 4. And of course, the number 4 is plural. And you can see like this ending here. This is a masculine nominative plural ending. So that, when we can at least identify the form, then we can, we'll know when we look up the word what its function is. And I don't want to make it seem like it's that easy. Out of context, this could be maybe an ablative singular, but here, in this being followed by the word for, it's probably going to be plural. So yeah, something like this, I don't think, again, numbers haven't been covered. This is the number 1. But we can see like this masculine nominative singular ending here. Ayang is a demonstrative pronoun. It just means this. And here's a word evocative, O monks. This comes up quite a bit. And then this dative is a little different. These, like I was saying, these words in blue are all dative singulars. This one comes from a different declension. It's not from the same, well, we could say family of nouns, a group of nouns, the declension of nouns as, say, like muggo is. And actually, when you get to the 8th chapter of Pali Primer, she introduces the neuters too, which only differ by a slight amount. So, seeing a word like, if we saw a word like nyayasa, you don't really know if it's masculine or neuter, and you don't even really, in this case, have to care much because you'll know the form is dative. Or this is a genitive singular, I'm sorry. It could be dative too, but we have these, this form of the dative here. One thing that I don't think DeSilva points out is when we get this kind of dative, it is sort of standing in for, I don't know why I say sort of, but I'll say it again. It's kind of standing in for an infinitive. In other words, this kind of dative expresses a purpose. So now, one other thing then, let's just go through, and I want to sort of just put these, I'm going to break this up so that it's not as, or that it maybe, hopefully, is a little easier to see what's going on. So we have this first sentence. There's no verb. Again, I don't think that DeSilva goes over this. We just, when that's the case, either in context, you're going to understand that you're using the verb from before. That can happen in poetry. Or we just have to supply the word or the verb to be some form, like hoti or bhavati. So here we have this, and then understand the word to be is the one direct path. All these masculine nominative singular, O monks. And then this path, it is visuddhiya, for the purification, satanang, of beings. So this satanang, we'll know, that will look very familiar. This is sato, being. In Sanskrit, that's sattva. So like in Pali, we get bodhisattva, an enlightened being. In Sanskrit and Mahayana, you'll hear more like bodhisattva. But so this is the one direct path for the purification of beings, living beings. And then, so you can see what's happening here. We've got a dative, and then we have this, I don't know which way it's going on the camera. We've got a dative, and then a genitive and a dative. Sorry about that. So here, we'll skip to the dative, a path that is, and I tried to put these down here, for the overcoming of. Now this one's a little longer. This one also DeSilva hasn't really talked about. I don't think she really explicitly talks about compounds. She introduces them. This is like Soka and Parideva. So it's Soka is grief, and Parideva is like lamentation, wailing. Neither of those do we use a lot, so you might think about some other words that would come to mind. But a lament, it's sorrow and some kind of maybe a vocal expression of that sorrow. So for the overcoming of sorrow and lamentation, we'll say it for now, say it that way. For the, and did I put it down here? For the annihilation of, the disappearance of, and here's another compound, very similar, dukkha. We've probably all come across dukkha. We could leave it as dukkha or just think of it as suffering. And here is like grief, or I think the Pali English Dictionary says pain and grief, or something like that, suffering and grief. And we're not trying to go super in depth on the words right now. We're kind of just looking at how these things fit together. Adhigamaya is for the attainment of nyaya, if I could say that right conduct. And then this is a word that you find a lot, sachi kiriyaya, or some form of that. Sometimes it's sachi karoti with the verb there. This kiriya comes from that, for the like kind of experiencing of one by oneself, or the doing of by oneself. Sometimes they more loosely like seeing with one's own eyes, and then nirvana. I hope I'm being somewhat clear about this. It's a little more awkward to put this one into English, but it's for the doing by oneself, or the maybe we should say the experiencing by oneself of nirvana. And so then we get to the end here, this namely, and now he's going back, and he's now describing this path again, but with nominative. In this case, nominative plural. Chattaro, the four satipatthana. Sometimes taken as like the four foundations of mindfulness. Sati, probably know from the Eightfold Path. Patthana is like, again, the Pali English Dictionary gives this as the setting up of mindfulness. I think they say it only happens in this compound here. So that's sort of just, I just wanted to share something like that, because I want to point out that it can seem overwhelming at first, like, oh, you don't get passages like this in the Pali Primer. You will get it more in Warder, especially as you go on, because his goal is to introduce you to I think really everything comes from the canon, and specifically the Digha Nikaya. And Gare and Karunatilaka, they also are taking straight from the canon. So right away, if you were to start in those, I don't know. I started with Warder, and it seemed like after a while I just couldn't process it the way that I hoped I could. So going through DeSilva, and there's also another older one, Narada, they're very helpful. But as I keep saying here, people probably know what a broken record is. The sooner you try to tackle some Pali from the canon, the better, and don't let it be, don't let it be a jarring experience or sort of overwhelming. You can just go and, you can see here that this is all really not too hard to manage. One thing that that this comes down to is kind of the vocabulary, and then how do we understand that? It's always coming down to forms and vocabulary. So if we can at least identify the form, then we'll know the function, and then we'll just, when we look up that word, we'll know what it's doing. So, but anyway, I would love to hear your experiences. If you've had any similar experiences in early on in Pali, or just at any point in your Pali studies, of reading the Buddha's Pali, or I think Bhikkhu Bodhi talked about it as Sutta Pali, which is different too from, like the commentarial Pali as well. So yeah, if you have any experiences you'd like to share, I would love to hear them. We could all benefit from that. So with that, peace.